Thank you for attending this session. Again, this session is going to be discussing franchising. So how do you franchise your business? What are the benefits? What are some of the rules and regulations that go along with franchising? And how do you know if it's for you? And that's a little bit of a more in-depth analysis that you really have to do when you sit back and look at your business. But on a very high level, we'll go over some of the initial requirements so that you'll be able to kind of ascertain whether or not it's something that you might be interested in. So the objectives for today, one, we're going to learn and understand what a franchise is. We're going to talk about how franchises are regulated, and then figure out what's the difference between a franchise and a license. We're also going to talk about understanding the benefits and being able to identify the basic steps in setting up your franchise. So the main rule for this session is ask questions. If there's something that's unclear, or you would like a further explanation of something, or there's a particular situation that you have in mind that you want to know an answer to, type the question into the box and we will get it answered. And if it's something that can't be answered on this webinar, then we'll follow up directly afterwards. Okay, so first off, what is a franchise? A franchise, in a very general definition, is a grant of the right to operate and share in the profits of a business or sell goods or services under a brand or chain name. So it's basically just giving somebody the opportunity to operate off of your brand and your goodwill in order to sell products or services. And these are some of the main examples of franchises, some that everybody knows: Starbucks, McDonald's, Burger King, Holiday Inn. These are behemoths in the field of franchising. These are companies that have mastered the art of maximizing profit through the franchising model. Now, granted, not everybody that opens a franchise will get as big as these franchises, but they are a really good example of what the franchising model can afford to a business owner if franchising is done in the right way. So franchise regulators, the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, is the federal body, well, the federal government body that regulates franchising. So franchising is regulated at a federal level, but it's also regulated at a state level. And these are mostly done through registration states, and those registration states will be identified later. Outside of actually having to register, there are some states that have additional requirements that go into registering advertising, or individuals that are going to be involved in the actual selling process of franchises within that particular state. The three elements of a franchise. So first, you have a trademark, and as the definition said, it is a franchise is allowing somebody to sell goods or services under your brand name. So that's your trademark. So the owner, identified as the franchisor, grants the franchisee or the purchaser the ability to sell goods or services using their mark, logo, catchphrase, service mark, or any other commercially identifying phrase or mark that the owner has produced or has been using in commerce. So that's the first thing. The first thing is granting that right of usage. The second thing is significant control or assistance. So this means that the franchisor has some aspect of control over how the franchisee operates his or her business. So that takes the form of requiring approval of the location. So when you go and you identify the actual property that you would like to place the business on, does that franchisor have the last say on whether or not you purchase that building or lease that building or you build out that space? Also, they could have control over how the space is built out. So if you notice, if you walk into McDonald's, every McDonald's is set up the same way. Every Burger King is set up the same way. So that's another aspect of control. Another thing is if you have mandatory trainings, if you have operations manuals that need to be followed, if you have menu items that have to be on the menu, if there are menu items that can't be changed, if all of the marketing material has to be approved by the franchisor, those are all elements of control. And then elements of assistance include pooled marketing. So pooled marketing is where you have the franchisor that is putting together marketing campaigns for all of the franchisees or for the whole franchise operation, and they're distributing those marketing tools, those marketing materials to the franchisees in order to put out to the general public. Another thing, the training programs are seen as a form of assistance. So sending individuals from the franchisor's main operation to these individual franchisee operations in order to train the staff that they bring on, train their management, get everything into shape in order to allow it to perform in the most in an efficient manner and in the way that the franchisor's operations are operating. And then the third and final thing is required payment. So required payment means that you are requiring the franchisee to pay at least $500 either before or within 6 months of that franchisee opening its doors for business. This can come in the form of an upfront payment. This can come in the form of royalties that are going to be due. This can also come in the form of requiring that franchisee to purchase certain products from you in order to open and operate that store. So any type of payment that's required either before or within the first 6 months. And sorry, I'll go back. And that's called the FTC franchising rule. So the accidental franchise, and I wanted to include this as a caveat because you have a lot of businesses that want to license certain products or license certain processes of their businesses, and in the process of licensing it, they accidentally cross over into that threshold of franchise. Now, some business owners try to engage in licensing agreements in order to circumvent some of the rules and regulations that come along with franchising, and it's a cost savings mechanism. So licensing is a lot cheaper than franchising. With a license, it's regulated by contract law, so it's just a contract between 2 or more people, and that's just giving a grant of right, the granting of a right for someone to act. And it really does come down to whether or not that act would be illegal if that licensing agreement was not in place. So a very simple example of a licensing agreement is, let's say that I want to sell shirts with the Chicago Bulls logo on it. Unless I am an authorized licensee of the NBA and the Chicago Bulls has granted me permission to license that product, I cannot put that product on a shirt. Now, where people mess up is they have all 3 elements available. So again, the elements are control, an upfront payment, and a trademark. And we'll go back here so you can see those again. So if you have all of those elements, all 3 of those elements present, then you are not licensing, you are franchising. And if you do try to get over with licensing when you know that you should have a franchise, there are certain fines, penalties, and possibly jail time that are handed down from the FTC. So this is a very this is a rule that can be applied to a lot in the legal field. A license is a license unless it's a franchise. So what this is saying is that you can grant a license, but you have to make sure that it's operating as a license. So the usual element that's there that pushes it from a license to a franchise is the element of control. So how are you controlling that license? How are you controlling the use, the selling of products, the training that comes along with that license? Because when you license a product, you're gonna receive a payment. When you license a product, there's usually a trademark, or there's usually some type of intellectual property protection and grant that goes along with licensing that product and/or process. So it usually does come down to control or assistance. So if you are looking to license and to stay out of that realm of franchising, make sure that you don't exercise a significant amount of control or give a significant amount of assistance. And again, this isn't a cut and dry assessment. This isn't a black and white analysis of the situation. It really does come down to a totality of the circumstances. So if you are in the space of licensing something and you're not sure if you're If you're crossing over to be a franchise, I would definitely say talk to a licensed professional, get their opinion, because there may be things that you can do in order to make it more clear that you're just licensing, or if there's no way to continue moving forward with licensing in the way that you have been, it may be necessary for you to take the steps in order to turn that into an actual operating franchise. So the benefits of franchising, there are two options when you own a business. You can either stay small, and by staying small, I mean stay the size that you are, and that's as far as your the number of operations that you have, the amount of employees that you have, or you can expand. You can grow. You can open up in different markets. You can hire new employees. You can try to bring in different revenue streams. So let's say that you want to expand. If you want to expand, there are two ways to expand in business: company-owned expansion or franchising. Company-owned expansion is when you, as the business owner, take responsibility for going and opening up different locations. So whether that's you hiring new market managers that go and open these locations, or whether that's you personally going to these different locations and opening up different stores, different operations, hiring the employees that are going to be involved in those operations, that's company owned. Franchising is allowing other individuals to go into those markets to open up. So you're granting them this right to go into that market, but you're not employing them. You're not taking active responsibility in the day-to-day operations. So here are some of the differences, and this is really why people like to choose franchising over company-owned expansion. So with company-owned expansion, it takes a lot of capital. You need capital for purchasing the land or the building. You need capital for the build out. You need capital for hiring employees. You need capital for the added inventory that you're going to put in there. So it takes a lot of money to go from one location to two locations. Each additional location requires a great amount of investment, and that investment usually comes in the form of a loan. Now, when you use financing in order to open up these different locations, you have to pay that back. So that's another, I guess, downfall of company-owned expansion, depending on what your take is on taking out loans. You also have increased overhead. So your overhead is what are your monthly costs that are going to be there no matter what. So your lease expense, your utilities, your payroll, all of that is overhead. And as you continue to expand via company-owned expansion, your overhead is going to continue to increase. Now, whether or not you're operating efficiently, that's going to dictate if that company-owned expansion will allow you to keep the margins that you have. It'll dictate whether your profit margins decrease. And I mean, in some instances, if you create enough economies of scale by generating company-owned expansion, then you could see your margins increase. But it's usually not the case that the margins increase with company-owned expansion. But there are people who are very good at business and very good at creating processes and expanding those processes under the same company. Outside of that, it takes a significant amount of time in order to open up these new locations. So as the business owner, you're the one that's going in and making sure that the training is done adequately. You're the one that's talking with the realtor in order to identify the space. You're the one that's looking at the market, making sure that it's right for expansion, making sure that you are able to capture a large enough amount of market share in order to make that expansion something that's feasible. Anytime you move into a different market, you don't want to lose money. And while you don't want to lose money in the long term, every time you open up in a market, you may lose over the first year, over the first 2 years, but long term, you want to make sure that the market is going to be profitable and that you have a consumer base that's going to want to engage in the products and or services that you're going to be offering. All of that takes time. So if you're engaging in your own company-owned expansion, you are the one that's going to be tasked with filling all of that out, with gathering that information, or with employing individuals to go out there and gather that information, which again, increases the expenses to you as a business owner. Another thing is management issues. So again, when you allow somebody else to go and expand in these other markets, you are not directly employing them. So they're not your manager as far as an employee goes. What happens when businesses expand is that the hierarchy of the company continues to increase. And so as that hierarchy continues to increase and you have more managers, more employees, it is up to that franchisor in order to, up to that business owner in order to make sure that everything is running smoothly. As you continue to scale, there comes a point in time where it gets harder to keep management in line. It becomes harder to make sure that management is on the same page. So with that, it makes it a little bit easier in order to franchise and have somebody else take ownership and control of that operation so that they can just deal with the management of those employees and the management of the managers in that location of their own accord. On the opposite end, you have franchising. So with franchising, limited capital requirements, it doesn't take a lot of the, relatively speaking, it doesn't take a lot of the business owner's capital in order to open up these new locations. Now, yes, the business owner has to spend money on the initial cost of franchising. Yes, there may be some cost initiated with registering in a new state if it's a registration state, but by and large, the cost of opening up a new location is going to be significantly reduced. And that's mostly because the franchisee takes on the majority of that cost of opening up in a new market. So whether that is leasing a space, getting an office, building out a building, whether that's making connections in that new market, all of that time and expense is going to be on the shoulders of the franchisee. They're the ones that's going to take responsibility for the expenses in that market. So the business owner, they don't increase their overhead expense because, again, the franchisee is paying for it. They don't have to expend a lot of capital, and then the capital that is expended in order to open that market, the franchise business or the franchisor doesn't have to pay that back because that's the franchisee's money. So you don't have the instance of having to repay a loan for the financing of opening up in a different market, and it makes expanding into different markets easier, which makes expanding your brand easier, which increases brand recognition. And it really does create a much more effective approach to getting your name in different markets quicker. Of course, that is if your business is set up the right way, which we'll talk about. Another good thing that comes from that efficiency is collective buying power. Now, when you are franchising your business, it makes it easier for you to expand into different markets quicker. When you expand into different markets quicker, you have more locations, you can purchase from distributors and manufacturers on a larger scale. That collective buying power will drive down the cost per unit for whatever units you have to purchase for inventory, or for whatever goods you're constructing. So when you drive down the cost of purchasing that inventory or the units, you increase your profit margin per location. You increase the amount of profit that you're going to receive based on you reducing your expenses. And that's something that's extremely important. So not only do you get collective bargaining power, but again, when you allow somebody to franchise your business, there's usually an upfront payment that comes along with that. That upfront payment is immediate cash flow to the franchisor, and the franchisor can use that for research and development, for added marketing, for a myriad of different things that could continue to help the franchisor increase the efficiency of the business at the top level. So overall, what you're doing is you're leveraging the assets of other individuals in order to expand your brand, in order to increase your revenue, and you're getting a semi-passive revenue stream. And I call it semi-passive because as a franchisor, there are still things that you have to do in order to make sure that the franchisees' businesses are operating efficiently and continuing to be profitable. But it's not as labor intensive as it would be if you were running a company-owned a company-owned location. And then again, you have a potential for decreased employee liability. And I say potentially because there have been cases where the employees of the franchisee have been seen to be employees of a franchisor. For a further analysis of whether or not the employees of the franchisee would be deemed your employee, that takes a lot of, I guess, digging into the finer details of the way that the relationship is going to be set up. So that's something that would have to be discussed offline. All right, a caveat. Again, franchising is not for everyone. You must have a replicable business process, and you must have that process down to a science. One of the biggest mistakes of people wanting to enter into the franchise world and create this franchise model is that they don't have their systems down well enough to where they can hand it to somebody in a booklet and say, here, go and recreate what we've done. When you talk about, again, your policies, procedures, handbooks, marketing plan, operation strategy, distribution methods, your chain, your streamline of both getting products in and then pushing products out, everything has to be written down. Everything has to be tried and tested. Your margins have to be right. You have to understand the timing of getting products in and pushing products out. You have to understand the levels of employees that you have to have during certain business hours. There's a lot that really goes into creating a system that you can hand off to somebody. And unless you are extremely comfortable with that system, and unless you've tried that system and tested it, and you know that it can work in other places, you could potentially be putting your business at risk by franchising. So again, make sure that your processes are down. And before you franchise, make sure that you talk to industry professionals and do what's called a feasibility study. So a feasibility study looks at not only your internal operations to make sure that everything that you're doing can be replicated by somebody else in a different market, but it also looks to see if the the products and or services that you are offering are right for being franchised. So would people want to franchise it in a different market? Does it have that attractive nature to where you could hand it to somebody and they could achieve a significant amount of market share or an adequate amount of market share in different markets? So a feasibility study is something that could make or break you when you go to engage and create this franchise model. So the franchising process, there are 3 sets of laws that go into franchising. So 1, disclosure laws, 2, registration laws, and 3, relationship laws. The first one that we're going to talk about is disclosure laws. So again, the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, controls disclosure laws. And this basically states that you have to tell a potential franchisee any and everything about your business before you offer to sell them your business, before you sign off on any documents, before you take any payments. You have to be extremely thorough. And on the next slide, we'll actually go through what has to be included. Well, some of the items that have to be included in what's called this franchise disclosure document. So again, this has to be submitted to the franchisee at least 10 business days before any document is signed or any payment is made. Now, if you don't have this franchise disclosure document and you are soliciting individuals in order to franchise your business, again, you could be facing penalties, fines, and possibly jail time. So it's very important. Now, it's also important to recognize that you do not register this franchise disclosure document with the Federal Trade Commission. This is just a document that is required to be given to the franchisee, and usually you have a signature page just so that the franchisee can sign off and say that they received it. They'll date it to say when they received it, just to make sure that you're following the laws. Now, when a franchise disclosure document does come into play is if the FTC starts to look into your franchise, then they can ask to see your franchise disclosure document and see the materials that you've been giving people before you've received any payment or you've offered any franchise for sale. Now, this is a very long document. The document is typically between 50 to 300 or more pages. 50 being on the very, very low end, and 300 being a little bit on the high end. As you can see, it requires a lot of information. So the list is, I mean, it is extensive, and this is only a partial list. So you have to tell them who you are as a franchisor. Did anybody own the business before you? Was the business a different name before it came into be what it is today? So basically the complete history of the business, also the business experience of the owners. Why are the owners qualified in order to not only operate this business, but to franchise this business? Previous and current litigation. So have you ever been sued? Have you ever had to sue somebody? What were the outcomes of those litigation disputes? And then bankruptcy. Was there ever a time that that you had to file a bankruptcy, whether it was a reorganization or whether it was a full-out bankruptcy? Now, along with this, you have to provide financials, and this is where a lot of people, I guess, have to go back and redo some things. So one of the requirements is that you have audited financials from the previous 3 fiscal years. Now, these have to follow GAAP procedures. There are some people who engage in doing their own financials. If that's the case, then you have to go back to an accountant, an independent financial accountant and CPA, and you have to have them audit your financials before you can include them in your franchise disclosure document. That could be costly if you haven't been working with an accountant prior to. So if you think down the road you would like to open up a franchise, make sure that you have all of your numbers in order, make sure that you're getting them audited regularly, and that you're working with a CPA that really knows what he or she is doing. Likewise, you have to give an estimate of an initial investment. So you can place this investment off of what it took you to open the business, or you can do a different analysis because maybe the business changed from the time that you opened it to where it is now. So how much can you reasonably expect the franchisee to pay? That's everything from leasing a building to build out to what they're going to pay you up front. So to purchasing inventory. So all of those expenses, what is going to be their initial investment? How much capital do they need to get this off the ground? Any restrictions on sources of products and services. For instance, there are some restaurants that are Pepsi restaurants, so they can't order Coke products in their restaurant. And likewise, there are some places that are solely occupied by Coke products, and they're not allowed to take Pepsi products in. So, if there are any restrictions on where the franchisees can get products or services, that must be included. What are the franchisees' obligations? In this process, are they the ones that are looking for and identifying real estate? Because there are some franchisors that want to make sure that they pick out the ideal spot, so they won't give that obligation or that right to the franchisee. What are the financing options? And really, this goes to, is the franchisor willing to give any financing options to the franchisee? So is the franchisor going to front the cost of the build out? Is the franchisor going to front the initial inventory that's going to be placed on site? So all of that is franchisor financing that would need to be placed in the franchise disclosure document. Likewise, trademarks. Before you franchise, you need to make sure that you have your intellectual property protected. So trademarks, if you have any patents, if you have any trade secrets that you need to rewrite up and redocument just to make sure that they're secure, if you need to make sure that they're protected. So anything dealing with intellectual property, you need to make sure that you have that in order. If you have not federally registered your trademark, then that is something that you definitely need to do before you think about engaging in producing a franchise. Also, a list of current franchise locations. So where have you franchised? Who are these franchise owners? What territory do they have? That's something that also needs to be included. And then a territory for that franchisee. So if I'm franchising in Chicago, am I giving this franchisee all of Chicago? Am I giving this franchisee certain zip codes in Chicago, a certain radius? That's very important because you don't want to put, well, for two reasons. One, you don't want to, well, if you offer somebody an exclusive territory and you place another franchisee on their territory, then you breach the franchise agreement that you enter into with that franchisee. So you want to make sure that the territories are clearly defined. And then another thing is there are certain states that prohibit encroachment on those territories. So if there are a lot of companies that engage in hybrid, so they offer franchises and they allow franchisees to open up in different markets, but at the same time, they continue to open up company-owned locations in certain markets. And so there are certain states that will prohibit company-owned locations from opening up close to where a franchisee has been given a territory. So these are, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the most important sections that you have to include in this extremely long franchise disclosure document. And an attachment to that franchise disclosure document is going to be the franchise agreement. So the franchise agreement is going to be the actual signed agreement between the two parties, and that's going to reiterate some of the things that are in the franchise disclosure document. It's also going to set out royalties, payment times, payment structures, and just the general nature of the relationship between, the detailed relationship between that particular franchisee and the franchisor. Registration requirements. So the registration requirements are regulated by state agencies, and they vary by states. Some states don't have any requirements. There are some states that do. So for the states that require actual franchise registration, this means that you either have to give this state agency the franchise disclosure document that you're using, or you have to just fill out a form stating that you are attempting to open up a franchise in that state. So these are the states, and these are the prices that you have to pay in order to open up those states. Again, not too many states, but it's still very important to know. And again, you have to register in these states before you are able to market or solicit anybody to open up a franchise in these states. So for the advertisement requirement, this is whether you are going to be advertising for people to purchase franchises, or you are advertising for people, advertising for the sale of the products or goods of the franchise. So these states, before you solicit, before you start putting out advertising saying that you're going to open up in this market, you have to register that advertising. So it's saying that whatever advertising you're going to use, you have to pass by the state body, the state agency that is in charge of regulation. And as you can see, this list is significantly reduced from the list of the franchise registration states. States requiring salesperson registration. Now, if you're going to have somebody actually on the ground soliciting potential franchisees and they're not an employee of the franchise, then these states you have to register. This means that if you're using a broker, if you're trying to have somebody that's out there helping you increase, helping you expand, because in order to identify the right franchisee and in order to get people interested in purchasing your franchise, it does take some soliciting and it does take some work. So if you're going to have a salesperson in that territory, or in any of these states, it is required that that person be registered with the state. And again, there are laws, there are penalties that come along with failing to register. Relationship laws, again, governed by state agencies. And again, these vary by state, and I did not go into the state breakdown for which states these require to, but these are just some of the restrictions and limitations that you have to look out for. So restrictions on termination. There are some states that limit your ability to terminate a franchise agreement to basing it on good cause. So that could be insolvency, bankruptcy, a franchisee voluntarily abandoning operations, a material breach of the franchise agreement. It could also include if a franchisee was convicted of a crime that related to the operations of that franchise. So there aren't too many states that have these restrictions, but if you are in a state that does have this restriction, you want to be very careful about how you draft the franchise agreement and how you go about terminating that franchise. Restrictions on non-renewal. This typically takes place if there isn't a renewal provision in the franchise agreement. And so this states, well, it doesn't say, but if the franchise agreement doesn't have a renewal provision, then there are there are certain restrictions on actually what they would call terminating that. So in some states, if you don't have a renewal provision, then they treat non-renewal the same way that they treat terminating. And again, with the restrictions on terminations, there are only certain reasons that you can terminate a franchise agreement, a franchise relationship. So a lot of these restrictions on non-renewal are in these states where they have restrictions on termination. Repurchase obligations. So there are certain states that will require you to repurchase the furniture, the inventory, and some of the other assets of the franchisee when they shut down that franchise. Again, we talked about encroachment. Good faith and reasonableness. That just means that if you're when you're dealing with a franchisee, you have to make sure that you are dealing with them in good faith and that you're being reasonable in the expectations and the obligations that you're putting on them. And then again, there are restrictions on requiring change in management. So you can't, as a franchisor, you can't arbitrarily walk into one of your franchisee's establishments and say, I don't like this manager, I'm going to change them out and hire somebody else. There are states that really restrict that, and they're really serious about franchisors not meddling in the management outside of having good cause and showing good reason, not meddling in the management and the personnel of their franchisees. And this is one of the ways that before we spoke about certain cases where employees of the franchisee have been deemed to be employees of the franchisor. And this is one of the ways in order to guarantee that the employees of the franchisee will be seen as your employees is if you make critical decisions as far as personnel goes, if you're actively engaged in the hiring and firing and not specifically, but really geared towards management, but also of the individual employees of that location. So you really want to be careful in how you manage that relationship, how you engage in that relationship, because it could lead to added liability to you as a franchisor. And then the cost of franchising. This is the important one for everyone. Now, again, franchising does have an upside because it does potentially create that immediate cash flow, that extra source of revenue, and increasing your brand and your market reach, which could also lead to an increase in revenue just by virtue of more people knowing about you. But it does come with a cost. Early on, it takes a good amount of investment in order to open up a franchise, and so in order to turn your business into a franchise. So attorney's fees, and that's for the franchise disclosure document. That's for looking through your policies and your handbooks in order to make sure that you are compliant with laws in your state and with the state in which you want to open up a franchise, and also drafting the franchise agreement that's going to be signed between you and the franchisee. So typically that's between $20,000 to $45,000. Accounting fees, again, if you don't have audited financials, you have to go to an accountant, a CPA, and get those financials audited before you can put them into your financial disclosure document. Typically between $10,000 to $20,000. Consulting fees. This is more so for if you don't have your training manuals and your business policies and other documents in order. It's not required, but sometimes it's good to deal with individuals that have done this, individuals that know how to put together manuals and policies and procedures that can be that you can transition from one location to another. Again, one of the main ways to ensure that your franchise is going to be successful is making sure that your processes and that your business model as a whole is easily replicable. So consultants that are knowledgeable in this field or knowledgeable in their industry can go a long way to ensuring that you are able to replicate that business model in different markets. And then trademark registration, as stated before, you need to make sure that you are trademarked. And I put trademark registration, but if there's a patent that you need to file before you actually engage in offering franchises, then you need to do that as well. Whatever type of protection your intellectual property needs on a federal level, make sure that you do that before you actually start to franchise, because you need to be protected. So that is it. Those are the high level facts regarding starting a franchise, regarding the legalities of beginning the process. And again, it really does take a very I guess meticulous assessment of where you are in business, where you want to go, and the feasibility of your products or services being I guess proliferated in different markets. It's something that could have a very huge upside, could be very beneficial as far as increased revenue, as far as increased market share, as far as increased market reach. But again, if you are not operating in a fashion that really lends itself well to the franchising model, you could be putting your whole business at risk. So with that, does anyone have any questions?